Harry Sherman, and I have to apologize for my uniform. Seems to be falling apart on me here. I don't know quite why I put on so much weight being buried 100 years, but I apparently have because my pants don't fit me very well. Um, that is that handsome fellow right there is me, if you can believe that. That's my brother Fred Sherman. Um, it's kind of hard to explain how someone that good looking could look like an old codger like me today, but if you were on the front lines of the First World War, even a few months could age you 50 years, so you know, understand. Um, if we were, obviously there's no gravestones here, and so this is not our gravesite. Our gravesite is down there further, but it was decided that perhaps it would be better to have some shade here today rather than be down in the hot sun. But if we were at our gravesite, you would realize pretty much what happened to Fred, my brother, and I. But let me go back to the beginning and tell you the story. I was born in 1895 on Tower Hill across the river, and my brother Fred was born in 1894. My mother's name was Mary, and my father was Fred. So Fred was obviously the first born son and was named after my father. In 1896, when my mother was carrying my sister Gertie, my parents decided to come move over here to Calais. There was quite a bit more work over here at the time, and so they came across the bridge and became Americans. That's all they had to do in those days. They bought themselves a big tenement building down on Hog Alley, which Union Street, I guess is called. We always call it the Hog Alley, right across from the railroad terminal and the wharves, because there was a lot of work there, and my father was able to find work on the wharves. And even when we were young boys, Fred and I, you know, we were pretty good sized kids. We could go across and make a nickel or a dime or a dollar, you know, helping people unload railroad cars and that sort of thing. So it was growing up here was a good experience for us. Of course, my mother always thought we should go to school. I had a lot of we had a lot of sisters, and more came after. There were 11 of us by the time I was 15, and so almost all of them were girls, and she thought we all should go to school, and the girls did mostly, but Fred and I, the school was up on Monroe Street in Calais, and not very far from the house, and about the only time Fred and I ever attended regular was at Christmas time, because our teacher was a woman named Mrs. Beckett. And Mrs. Beckett was the aunt and the sister of the people who made all that candy down there, that ribbon candy. And of course, when they're making that candy, it would break up sometimes. There'd be little pieces they couldn't sell it. And Mrs. Beckett, her first name was Maud, she'd bring us candy at Christmas time. And so we went to school at Christmas time, but the rest of the time we just hung around the rail yards and the wharves and the ships, and it was a good life for us. As we got older, of course, we both got jobs. Fred got himself a job as a deckhand on the Henry Eaton, which was a steamship that went up and down the river every day, back and forth between St. Andrews and Robinson and Eastport and Calais. And I got a job unloading rail cars and that sort of thing. And we had girlfriends, and we were doing pretty well for ourselves. I can remember Calais was a pretty booming place then. Moving pictures came. We had moving pictures for the first time. We had two movie theaters, the Palace Theater and the Opera House, and things were going pretty well for us. And then in the summer of 1914, I was working down on the rail yard, unloading a rail car, and all the men were talking about this Duke who got shot over in a place in Europe called Serbia. Well, I didn't know where Serbia was, and it didn't sound like anything serious to me, but they said there was going to be a big war over there, and which I couldn't understand why there'd be a big war over shooting a Duke over in a place called Serbia. But sure enough, before I knew it, all of my friends from St. Stephen and my relatives from over the river were being shipped off to Europe, Belgium, France, to fight the Germans. And the war, which my mother, who was a bright woman, and she read the papers, and everybody said it was going to be a short war, but it wasn't a short war. And I can remember both Fred and I asking our mother, saying, you know, we were Canadians once, we ought to go over and enlist in the army over in Canada. And she said, well, no, you can't do that because you're Americans now. And our president, President Woodrow Wilson, he does not want to get into this war. He says that the Europeans are always fighting these wars and we got no part of it. And he says there's a law now that says that you can't enlist. The Neutrality Act says you can't enlist in the army in Canada. So we always listened to our mother pretty much, and so we didn't enlist, and we just stayed here and worked on the wharves. But you know, this Kaiser Wilhelm, I believe his name was, he was a nasty sort of fellow, and he kept doing things that aggravated our president. And finally, our president declared war on Germany in April of 1917. And at that time, one of my sisters had married a fellow from Calais named Ralph Mitchell. And Ralph says, I'm going to go sign up. And he was the first person in Calais to sign up, and I was the second. Oh, my mother was mad. She was mad. We signed up because she couldn't do anything about it. And Fred, he wanted to sign up too, but she wouldn't let him because he had a good job on the steamship. And we needed the money with 11 mouths to feed. So off Ralph and I, we went down to Augusta. We were in the 1st Maine National Guard unit. We were there about 60 days, and Fred showed up. We knew we wouldn't last long. So we were all there, Fred, Ralph and I, and a whole bunch of Calais fellows that we knew. And we trained there for a while, and then they sent us down to Massachusetts, and they trained us there for several months. And then they formed us into the 26th Infantry Division, known as the Yankee Division, because it was all of the National Guard units from New England. And in October of 1917, they took us all to New York, put us on these big ships, and took us across the ocean to France. And that was quite a trip. I can remember that. We were in a convoy. There were dozens and dozens of ships on all sides of us. And I spent a lot of time on the water as a young man, but nothing like that in October out on the Atlantic. We were all sick. We were all hanging over the rail half the time. When we weren't throwing up, we were checking for German submarines because everyone said we were going to get sunk by the submarine. But somehow they got us over to France safe and immediately took us up to a place called Soissons, which was on the front lines, and put us with some French units. And those Frenchmen, I have to tell you, they were good soldiers. They taught us everything we needed to know to stay alive, hopefully, in the trenches, and how to deal with gas attacks. And I'd have been very happy to spend the whole war fighting alongside those fellas. But our general, who was General Pershing, they called him Blackjack Pershing, he agreed with us. He said, those French soldiers are good soldiers, but the generals are stupid. He says, those generals, I don't trust them, they're no damn good. He says, the only worst generals in the only army with worst generals is the British. He says, the only way our soldiers are going to go on the front lines is as a division and under American command. And so in November, they started moving us out, and by January of 1918, our whole division had been moved 300 miles east to the front lines, and we had our own sector that we had to occupy. And we immediately went into combat with the German army. We were the first American units to have any combat experience with the Germans. And for the next 4 months, we fought the Germans. They fought us. We went back and forth. We'd capture a town, and then they would capture it back, or we'd capture some trenches, and they'd capture it back. No one seemed to make any progress. It was just a terrible war. Of course, we were all afraid. We all admit that. But we did our duty. And then on June 18th, 1918, the Germans started a major offensive on our front. And they pushed through our lines and actually came all the way into Survey, which is where we were stationed. I was on patrol. The battle went on for 2 days, 2 entire days it went on. And when I finally got back to the unit, Frank Lowther, who was a friend of ours, he lived over on Monroe Street, he saw me coming, and I could see from his face that something had happened. So I could see it. And he all he could say was, you know, Ralph tried to get him out, and Ralph being my brother-in-law. And when I found Ralph, I learned the sad news that Fred had been killed, that an artillery shell had buried his bunker, and everyone in it was killed, and they had dug them out, but it was too late. His body had already been sent off to the graves registration people. And of course, I was devastated. All I could think about was my mother. How was she going to deal with this terrible tragedy in the family, losing Fred? You know, I was the favorite. I was, no question. Everyone knew that. But she loved Fred, and she loved all of us. And for her to lose Fred was just going to be devastating to her too. And I thought, well, I got to write her a letter. So I went back to my tent to write a letter. And before I got to my tent, when I got to my tent, they were breaking my tent down, and they were shipping our whole unit back toward Paris, because the Germans had made a major breakthrough and were moving toward Paris, and Paris was in danger of being captured. 2 days later, we got back to the front lines near Paris, and for the next 5 weeks, we fought day and night to stave off the German offensive. And within 2 weeks, we had managed to do that. We had stopped the offensive. And in fact, the newspapers in Paris were calling us the saviors of Paris. But we still had to push the Germans back, which we did over the next 3 weeks. And then on July 22nd, we had only one more objective to take. It was a roadway. And I can remember being in sight of that road and thinking, well, we finally done it. And that was the end. I don't know what happened to me. All I know is that I don't remember being on a stretcher or whatever. I was killed. And I was buried along with Fred in France in the summer of 1918. You're going to see Dr. Miner later on. Of course, I understand we won that war. I always thought we would. Dr. Miner says that when the Yankee division, my division, came back, the 26th Infantry Division, he said they had a big celebration down on the pier down in New York for the division. Someone brought this up and left it on our grave today, and I really appreciate it. He says, Dr. Miner says that was one of the pennants that they were waving in New York Harbor when they brought us back, and they brought the division back. Of course, I wasn't on the boat, neither was Fred. We were buried in France, and well, you know, it was 1921 before our bodies were brought back, and Dr. Miner was the mayor at the time, and he gave a nice speech. And they buried us in the Baptist church over here, and they had a ceremony at the Baptist church over here on Church Street, and they buried us in the graves down there. And I always hoped that maybe that provided some comfort to my mother and father, although I'm not sure it would have. Under the circumstances, you know, there were 450 or so of Calais boys who went to war in World War I, and a lot of them, hundreds of them, served over on the front lines. Many battles, and you know, and only 2 that were killed were my brother and I. Only 2 casualties. And, you know, I never wish anybody ill, but it just seems to me that some other family could have sacrificed one of their children, and at least Fred could have come back. Someone could have come back for my mother, but she lost us both. So it was a tragic situation for the family. My mother and father eventually bought a farm down here on South Street for a while. In the 30s, they had a farm down there, and they moved out of town. But you know, they had more children after we left, and the last child they had was a boy, and he's buried down in the grave with us. His name is Victor Sherman. And, he fought World War II, so he wasn't killed. His middle name is Harry. So that's my story. It's certainly not a sad story, but there were a lot of those stories in the war. But it's been 100 years, and I'm just happy to be up tonight speaking to you all. And after you go, then of course we all get together here together, and I get to talk to Dr. Miner for a while, and he's going to tell us about all the fellows from Calais who we served with and where they ended up. I did talk to him briefly, and he tells me that Ralph, who survived the war, my brother-in-law, and my sister, they moved out to California. I can't imagine living all the way out in California, but that's where they went. So anyway, I appreciate you listening to me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your tour.